None other than Bronwyn Bishop, Steve Price and Nicholas Reece. Nicholas in the news today, pocket square and all. We'll get to that in a second. But Price, you've been a couple of weeks since we've seen you, so I want to ask you this. OK, if I had told you that Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg were going to increase taxes on 10 million people at $1,500 at a time when cost of living was allegedly the #1 issue in the Victorian, New South Wales and federal election of last year, do you think the media would stay quiet, or do you think the media would be doing something similar to what I've done tonight, that this must be deferred?
They'd be hung, drawn and quartered, wouldn't they? Paul, great to be back with you. And I think it was very important that you pointed out that this was let out over Easter, when the majority of Australians had taken off on Easter Thursday and didn't go back to work until Easter Tuesday. And so it bypassed much of the media attention. And cost of living is clearly the biggest issue. I mean, figures out in Victoria today show that the rental vacancy rates in Melbourne are below 1%. Wow. You've got people queuing around the block to get a rental apartment. People can't afford to buy their own properties, and so they're going into the rental market. This is just ridiculous. And if this is the way Jim Chalmers is going to try and balance up his budget, we're all in big trouble, mate.
Yeah, I mean, Nick, obviously we talked about it last week. I'll give you the tip. We're going to talk about it next week. We'll talk about it the week before. We'll talk about it the week before, because I'm not going to play the game of let's just talk about The Voice every single night, because that's the distraction that Albo wants. The year-long distraction, supposedly the front and centre, is cost of living. As we talked about before, and I don't want to have the stuff about the stage 3 tax cuts, I want to talk about this policy. When you've just said what Steve said about the rental market, when you know the difficulties people are having right now when it comes to cost of living, how can they possibly justify taking the $1,500 from 10 million people? They're trying to do as the pre-budget sell will help on cost of living, while the actual consequence of their decision is they're going to take more than they're planning to give.
Yeah, it's much easier to say you're going to do something about cost of living when you're in opposition compared to government. Governments often get into the trap of claiming they're going to do something big to help people with cost of living, but it is very, very hard to do. Jim Chalmers doesn't, have any say over the war in the Ukraine, which is driving up global energy prices. He doesn't have much say over what's going with global supply chains, which is driving up the price of everything. He doesn't even control interest rates. That's the Reserve Bank. And so the major levers that drive inflation, the federal government, through fiscal policy, has not a lot to do with. Yes, the low-income tax offset was actually a pretty good tax break, because it largely benefited middle-income and low-income earners, and so giving them or prioritising them through tax relief is something that I certainly support. And so, yes, if there was a choice of we've got to balance the budget somehow, I think we all agree that we've got to start paying that $1 trillion debt. So if you had to choose between the low-income tax offset and the stage 3 tax cuts, I'd say keep the low-income tax offset, and it's time to roll back that commitment around the stage 3 tax cuts, which go largely to high-income earners. And really, I don't know where that, I don't think that group is the one that most needs help at this point in time.
I love you, but that's the dodge of all dodge. And I get it, right? I get what everyone's saying. Let's just keep that as the angry bloke blowing up about that. No one's paying attention. So just talk about stage 3 tax cuts. Bronwyn, I am infuriated about this issue, not because, the political harm to look, they're going to win the next one. They'll probably be around for 10 years. I get all of that, okay? But when you are going to have the whole sell of your budget, every single day we're going to do something about cost of living relief, not one person in the press room, including the people who've written the stories about the 10 million people's tax increase, stand up and say, hang on, just 1 second, Jim. Here's the question. Here's the challenge to everyone hate watching the show in Canberra tonight. Tomorrow, just say, okay, Jim, about that cost of living stuff, aren't you taking $1,500 off people first? So unless you're giving $1,501, you're taking more than you're giving, right?
Yes. And indeed what he's doing is a fraud on the Australian people.
Yeah.
Socialist 101, tax and spend. There is going to be an increase of revenue coming from our export earnings on good old coal and iron ore, and they're going to spend the lot, blow the lot, just as they did in the last budget when they took office. The point is this, that every aspect of Jim Chalmers is to blame Ukraine. My goodness, if it hadn't happened, what else would he blame? The fact of the matter is that domestic tax policy has nothing to do with the war in Ukraine. It's got to do with the decision you make. Now, the Reserve Bank has been doing all the heavy lifting on inflation and wearing all the opprobrium. Chalmers will stand there and say, oh, they're independent, when he knows damn well that he's got a whole lot of other people in his cabinet speaking out and saying, you've got to pause.
But also, it's
pause
not
the-
stimulus. It's money you already earn.
But this is the point. What he is doing is saying that we're going to put your wages up and you're going to have a few bits and pieces that will come from the government and you'll all be better off. The fraud is that the money that they're getting in is worth less and will buy less.
Correct.
And they're taking this money away at exactly that time.
Well, this is what I'm.
And monetary policy are way out of whack.